An original story, narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. The carriage door closes with a hollow thud that echoes across the gravel courtyard of Ravenshire House. Catherine Hartwell stands at the top of the stone steps, her traveling cloak still damp from the morning rain, watching the Duke through the tall windows of the entrance hall. Alexander Ravenshire has not moved from his position beside the mahogany table where the estate ledgers lie open. His waistcoat hangs unbuttoned. His cravat is loosened around his throat. The butler approaches her with measured steps and speaks in a voice meant only for her ears. "His Grace has not slept since you left, my lady." Catherine's gloved hand tightens on the iron railing. 3 days. She has been gone only 3 days. But the man standing in that hall looks as though he has aged a year. The house feels wrong without her. Alexander Ravenshire stood at the window of his study on the second floor, staring out at the grounds that stretched toward the distant line of trees, marking the edge of the estate. The morning light was pale and cold. It cast long shadows across the manicured lawns and reflected dully off the surface of the ornamental lake. He had stood here for hours, perhaps longer. Time had lost its shape since Catherine left. Behind him, the ledgers lay open on his desk. The same ledgers he had been reviewing 3 weeks ago when he first noticed the irregularity. A withdrawal, significant, carefully hidden within the routine expenses of the household. The signature was Catherine's, clear and elegant, unmistakable. He had said nothing. That was the beginning of the silence that drove her away. The house around him moved in whispers. The servants had learned quickly to soften their footsteps on the marble floors. They spoke in low voices when they passed through the corridors. The usual sounds of the estate, the clatter of breakfast service, the rhythm of daily tasks, the occasional laughter from the kitchens had all diminished to a muted hum. It was as though Ravenshire House itself mourned her absence. Alexander turned from the window and looked at the ledgers again. He had studied them so many times in the past 3 days that he could recite the figures from memory. But the numbers told him nothing he wanted to know. They told him only what he already suspected. That Catherine had taken money from the estate accounts. That she had done so without telling him. That she had hidden it deliberately. But they did not tell him why. And that was the question he should have asked. The door to the study opened quietly. Graves, the butler, entered with a tray. Tea, toast, a small plate of cold meat. Alexander had not asked for any of it. Graves set the tray on the side table and paused. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "you should eat something." Alexander did not look at him. "I am not hungry. You have not eaten since yesterday morning." "I am aware." Graves hesitated. He was an old man. He had served the previous Duke, Alexander's father, for 30 years before Alexander inherited the title. He had seen the family through births and deaths, through scandals and triumphs. He was not easily unsettled, but the past 3 days had unsettled him. "Her ladyship will return," Graves said quietly. She gave her word. Alexander's jaw tightened. "I know. Then perhaps you might rest until she does." "I cannot." Graves studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded and withdrew without another word. Alexander sat down at his desk and rested his head in his hands. The truth was that he could not rest. Not because he was waiting for Catherine to return, but because he knew, with a clarity that had come too late, that he had failed her. He had doubted her. He had let suspicion grow in the silence between them. He had watched her across the dinner table with careful, measuring eyes. He had spoken to her with a distance in his voice that she could not have failed to notice. And she had understood what he suspected, even though he never said it aloud. That was the cruelty of it. She had known, and she had left him to sit with his unspoken accusation until he was ready to ask the question he should have asked from the beginning. The letter she had left on his desk 3 days ago was still there. He had read it so many times that the paper was beginning to soften at the creases. The words were brief, elegant, final. "I will return when you are ready to ask the question you cannot speak." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of his desk. Then he stood and walked to the door. The household was waiting. He could feel their uncertainty in the air. They did not know what to do with a duke who had stopped sleeping, who had stopped eating. who stood at windows and stared at nothing. He descended the stairs slowly. The marble hall stretched before him, empty and cold. The morning light fell through the high windows in pale columns. Everything in Ravenshire House was designed to impress. The marble floors, the gilded mirrors, the portraits of ancestors lining the walls. But none of it mattered without her. Catherine had brought warmth to this place, not through decoration or extravagance, but through her presence, through the way she moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, through the way she spoke to the servants with respect, through the way she sat beside him in the library in the evenings and discussed the estate with an intelligence that had surprised him at first and then humbled him. He had not expected to love her. Their marriage had not been designed for love. 7 years ago, Alexander Ravenshire had stood in the chapel of his family estate and watched Catherine Hartwell walk toward him down the aisle. She was not the bride he would have chosen for himself, but he was not in a position to choose. The Ravenshire family was old, noble, respected, but the estate had been mismanaged for a generation. Alexander's father, the late Duke, had been a stern man, proud, unyielding. He had believed that the family name alone was enough to sustain their position. He had refused to adapt to the changing realities of land management and investment. By the time he died, the estate was on the edge of financial collapse. Alexander inherited a title and a burden. The marriage to Catherine Hartwell was a practical solution. Her family was respected, but declining. Her father, a baronet, had invested wisely in trade and industry. He had wealth, but no title of significance. The alliance benefited both families. The Hartwells gained social elevation. The Ravenshire estate gained financial stability. Catherine understood this as well as Alexander did. The wedding was dignified, proper, emotionally restrained. They spoke their vows with calm voices. They signed the documents with steady hands. They greeted their guests with polite smiles. And when the day ended, they retired to separate chambers, as was expected of couples in their position. Alexander had assumed their marriage would remain that way, a partnership of convenience, respectful but distant. He had been wrong. In the months that followed, something unexpected began to grow between them. It started with small things, shared decisions over the management of the estate. Catherine had a mind for figures. She understood finance in a way that Alexander's father never had. She reviewed the accounts with him. She suggested improvements to the tenant housing. She proposed investments in new agricultural methods. Her intelligence was quiet, but undeniable. Alexander found himself seeking her opinion more often, not because he was required to, but because he valued it. They began to spend their evenings together in the library. At first, they discussed the estate, but gradually, their conversations expanded. They spoke about books, about philosophy, about the weight of responsibility that came with titles and land. Catherine listened when Alexander spoke about his father's legacy, the expectations that had been placed on him since childhood, the fear that he would fail to live up to the family name. She did not offer empty reassurances. She simply listened, and in her listening, Alexander found something he had not expected. Understanding. Over the years, their companionship deepened. It was not the passionate romance of novels or poetry. It was quieter than that, more solid. It was built on shared decisions and mutual respect, on long evenings and small gestures, on the way she placed her hand on his arm when they walked through the gardens, on the way he looked for her in a crowded room. Alexander never named what he felt. Neither did Catherine. But it was there, a foundation that felt like the beginning of love, until 3 weeks ago. Until he found the irregularity in the accounts and said nothing. Until doubt entered their home and silence grew between them like a wall. The irregularity appeared in the ledgers for the previous quarter. Alexander had been reviewing the accounts late one evening when he noticed it. A withdrawal, £10,000. It was listed under routine estate expenses, but the description was vague. And when Alexander cross-referenced it with the other records, he found no corresponding expenditure. The signature on the withdrawal was Catherine's. He stared at it for a long time. His first thought was that it must be a mistake, an error in the bookkeeping. But the more he examined the records, the clearer it became that the withdrawal had been deliberate, carefully hidden. Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest. He did not want to believe that Catherine would take money from the estate without telling him. But he could not ignore the evidence in front of him. The amount was significant. The concealment was deliberate, and he did not know why. He told himself he would ask her about it, that there must be a reasonable explanation. But when he sat across from her at dinner that evening, the words would not come. He watched her instead, studied her, looked for signs of guilt or deception. Catherine noticed. She was too intelligent not to. Over the following days, the silence between them grew heavier. Alexander could not bring himself to ask the question directly. It felt like an accusation, and he did not want to accuse her. He wanted her to tell him, to offer an explanation without being asked. But she did not. Instead, she withdrew. She stopped joining him in the library in the evenings. She took her meals in her chambers. She moved through the house with a quiet dignity that made Alexander's chest ache. But she said nothing. The wound was not in his words. It was in the absence of trust. 2 weeks after he discovered the irregularity, Catherine made her decision. Alexander came down to breakfast one morning and found a letter on his desk. Her handwriting, brief, elegant, final. I will return when you are ready to ask the question you cannot speak. She was gone by the time he read it. The first day without her, Alexander told himself she would return by evening. She did not. The household felt her absence immediately. The servants moved through their tasks with uncertainty. Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, came to Alexander in the afternoon and asked if there were any special instructions. He told her to continue as usual, but nothing felt usual. By the second day, restlessness had taken hold of him. He could not sit still. He paced the halls. He stood at windows. He returned to the ledgers again and again, searching for something he had missed, some clue that would explain the withdrawal. But the numbers told him nothing. He began to search through older records, files from previous years, documents his father had kept. He did not know what he was looking for, but he could not stop. On the third day, Alexander stood before the ducal council. The council met quarterly to review the financial and administrative affairs of the estate. It was composed of senior landowners, legal advisors, and representatives of the tenant farmers. Alexander's father had treated the council with formal respect, but little real consultation. Alexander had tried to be different. He had tried to govern with transparency. Now, standing before them, he made an unprecedented confession. There has been an irregularity in the estate accounts, he said. His voice was steady. His hands were not. A significant withdrawal that was not properly documented. I take full responsibility for this error. Any financial discrepancy falls upon me alone. The room fell silent. Lord Pemberton, the eldest member of the council, leaned forward. Your Grace, are you saying there has been mismanagement? I am saying that I failed to maintain proper oversight. But the withdrawal, who authorized it? Alexander met his gaze. I did. It was a lie, but it was the only answer he could give. He would not allow Catherine's name to be questioned. Not by the council, not by anyone. The murmurs began immediately. Quiet but unmistakable. Alexander's reputation, carefully maintained over 7 years, was now in question. The council members exchanged glances. Lord Pemberton's expression was unreadable. We will need a full accounting, Your Grace, Pemberton said finally. You will have it. Alexander left the council chamber with his head high, but inside he felt hollow. His reputation no longer mattered to him. The only thing that mattered was Catherine, and he had failed her. That evening, Graves found him standing in the main hall. Your Grace, the butler said quietly, you should rest. I cannot. You have not slept since her ladyship left. Alexander turned to look at him. Graves' face was lined with age and concern. The old man had served this family for decades. He had seen Alexander grow from a boy into a man, into a duke. He had never questioned, never judged. But now, there was something in his eyes that Alexander could not ignore. She has never acted without honor, Your Grace, Graves said. The words pierced him. Alexander closed his eyes. I know. Then perhaps you might trust that. Graves bowed and withdrew, leaving Alexander alone in the hall. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. The house was silent. And for the first time since Catherine left, Alexander allowed himself to feel the full weight of his failure. He had doubted the one person who had never given him reason to doubt. That night, Alexander returned to his father's study. It was a room he rarely entered. His father had kept it locked during his life, and Alexander had respected that boundary, even after his death. But now, standing in the doorway, Alexander felt a pull he could not explain. He lit a lamp and stepped inside. The room was exactly as his father had left it. The desk was heavy and dark. The shelves were lined with books on law, history, and estate management. The air smelled of old paper and leather. Alexander moved slowly through the space, running his fingers along the spines of the books. On the desk, he found a locked drawer. He searched for the key. It took him nearly an hour, but he finally found it hidden in a small wooden box on one of the shelves. He unlocked the drawer and pulled it open. Inside, he found a private journal. The pages were yellowed with age. The handwriting was his father's. Neat, precise. Alexander sat down and began to read. The journal covered the final years of his father's life. Most of the entries were mundane. Notes on estate business. Observations about tenants and crops. But as Alexander read further, he found something that made his breath catch. A debt of honor. His father had been involved in a business venture with another family, a venture that had failed. The other family had lost a significant amount of money. Alexander's father had promised to compensate them, but the debt had never been recorded officially. It existed only in this journal, a private obligation, a matter of honor. The amount was £10,000. Alexander's hands shook as he turned the pages. His father had written about the debt several times. He had intended to settle it, but he had died before he could, and no one had known. No one except Catherine. Alexander stood abruptly, the journal clutched in his hands. He moved to the shelves and began pulling down boxes of old correspondence. Letters, documents, financial records from years past. He searched through them with growing urgency. Finally, he found it. A letter from Catherine to the family his father had wronged. It was dated 2 years ago. In it, she explained that she had discovered the debt through her own inquiries into the estate's history. She offered to settle it using her personal inheritance, money from her mother's estate. She asked that the matter be kept private. She did not want to bring shame to the memory of the late Duke. The response was brief but grateful. The debt had been settled. The family's honor had been restored. Catherine had done this in silence. She had used her own money to protect the Ravenshire name, to preserve the memory of Alexander's father. She had told no one because the debt itself was a source of shame. She had hidden the withdrawal in the estate accounts to avoid drawing attention to it. It was not a betrayal. It was an act of profound loyalty. Alexander sank into the chair behind the desk. The journal and the letters lay before him. The evidence of Catherine's sacrifice, the proof of her honor, and he had doubted her. He had wounded the one person who loved his family's honor more than her own pride. The grief that washed over him was overwhelming. He pressed his hands to his face and felt the sting of tears he had not allowed himself to shed. He had failed her, not just by doubting her, but by failing to see the depth of her love. She had given everything to protect him, and he had repaid her with silence and suspicion. Alexander did not sleep that night, or the night after. The servants whispered about his condition. Mrs. Dalton spoke to Graves in hushed tones. Graves spoke to the senior footman. The household was worried, but Alexander did not care. He remained in the main hall, waiting. He sent no letter, no messenger. He knew Catherine would return, not because he deserved it, but because she was a woman of her word. She had said she would return when he was ready to ask the question he could not speak. He was ready now. But the question he needed to ask was not about the money. It was about forgiveness. The annual ducal ball was approaching. It was a tradition expected by society. The Ravenshire family had hosted it for generations. Alexander considered canceling it. The thought of standing in a ballroom full of guests while Catherine was gone felt unbearable. But Graves advised against it. She would not wish the household to suffer for this, Your Grace, the old man said quietly. Her ladyship has always thought of others first. Alexander knew he was right. Catherine had always put the needs of the household above her own. She had protected the estate, the servants, the family name, even when it cost her. "Prepare for the ball," Alexander said finally. Graves nodded and withdrew. Alexander stood alone in the hall. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. The house waited. And so did he. The fourth morning arrived with a pale dawn. Alexander stood in the main hall. He had not moved from his position beside the table, where the ledgers still rested. His waistcoat hung unbuttoned. His cravat was loosened. His eyes were red from sleeplessness. But he did not care. The clock struck 5, and then the front door opened. Catherine stepped inside. She was travel-worn. Her dark cloak was dusty from the road. Her dress showed the signs of days spent away. But her posture was impeccable. She carried a folded handkerchief in her gloved hand, a small personal detail that grounded her humanity. Graves appeared from the side corridor. He moved to greet her, his expression carefully neutral. But his voice carried a weight that made Catherine pause. "His Grace has not slept since you left, my lady." Catherine's breath caught. Her eyes moved across the hall, to the far end, where Alexander stood. He looked broken. The man who had always carried himself with such dignity, who had always maintained the composure expected of a duke. Now he stood before her with his clothing disheveled and his face lined with exhaustion. His eyes met hers across the distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was not cold. It was the silence of two people who had journeyed through pain and arrived at the same realization. The clock's chime echoed through the empty hall. Catherine took a step forward, then another. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor. Alexander did not move. He simply watched her, waiting. She stopped a few paces away, close enough to see the exhaustion in his face, close enough to see the grief in his eyes. "You look unwell," she said quietly. "I am. You should rest." "I cannot. Not until I have asked you the question I should have asked 3 weeks ago." Catherine's hands tightened on the handkerchief. "And what question is that?" Alexander took a slow breath. "Will you forgive me?" The words hung in the air between them. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. "You do not need to ask my forgiveness, Alexander." "I do. I doubted you. I let suspicion grow between us. I failed to trust you when you had given me no reason to doubt. You did not know. I should have asked." His voice broke slightly. "I should have come to you and asked. Instead, I let silence do the damage." Catherine closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, her expression was softer. "I should have told you what I had done. You should not have needed to. I should have trusted you without question." They stood together in the growing light. The mistakes had been named, the wounds acknowledged. "I found the journal," Alexander said quietly. "My father's journal. I found the letters. I know what you did. I know why you did it. And I know that I have wounded the most honorable person I have ever known." Catherine's breath hitched. "You were protecting the estate. You had every right to question. I had no right to doubt you." Alexander stepped closer. "You used your own inheritance to settle my father's debt. You did it in silence to protect his memory, to protect this family, and I repaid you with suspicion. You did not know. I should have known you." His voice was raw. "I should have known that you would never act without honor, that you would never betray this family. I should have known because I know you, Catherine. I have known you for 7 years, and I failed you." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her gloved hand gently over his. The gesture was simple, quiet, but it carried the weight of forgiveness. Alexander closed his eyes. He felt the warmth of her hand through the fabric of her glove. He felt the grace he did not deserve. When he opened his eyes again, he lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his forehead. A gesture of humility, of gratitude, of love. "I will never doubt you again," he said quietly. "And I will never leave you in silence," Catherine replied. They stood together in the dawnlight. The house around them was waking. The servants moved quietly through the corridors. The day was beginning. But for Alexander and Catherine, something new had been forged. A love no longer based on duty or admiration alone, but on trust tested and restored. Alexander did not approach her immediately after that moment. Instead, he turned to Graves, who had remained at a respectful distance. "Gather the senior members of the household. Alexander said. His voice was steady now, certain. Graves hesitated. Your Grace, the housekeeper, the steward, the senior footmen and ladies' maids. I wish to speak to them. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. Alexander, what are you doing? What I should have done from the beginning. Within minutes, the senior members of the household gathered in the hall. Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, stood with her hands folded. Mr. Brennan, the steward, looked uncertain. The footmen and maids lined the walls, their expressions curious but respectful. Alexander stood before them all. Catherine remained beside him, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. I have gathered you here, Alexander began, because I owe you the truth. The servants exchanged glances, but said nothing. 3 weeks ago, Alexander continued, I discovered an irregularity in the estate accounts. A withdrawal of £10,000, the signature on the withdrawal was Lady Catherine's. A murmur ran through the gathered staff. Catherine's grip on his arm tightened slightly, but she did not speak. I said nothing, Alexander went on. I allowed suspicion to grow. I allowed silence to damage the trust between us. And in doing so, I wronged the woman who has shown more honor than I deserve. Mrs. Dalton's eyes softened. Mr. Brennan's expression shifted from uncertainty to understanding. The truth, Alexander said, his voice growing stronger, is that my father incurred a debt of honor before his death, a debt that was never recorded officially. Lady Catherine discovered this debt through her own inquiries. She used her personal inheritance, money from her mother's estate, to settle it. She did this to protect the Ravenshire name, to preserve the memory of my father. She told no one because the debt itself was a source of shame. The hall was utterly silent now. Lady Catherine acted with a loyalty and honor that I failed to recognize, Alexander said. I doubted her when I should have trusted her. I wounded her when I should have honored her. Whatever judgment falls upon this house, let it fall upon me alone. His voice did not waver, but the emotion in it was clear, raw, honest. The servants stood in respectful silence. Some of the maids had tears in their eyes. Mrs. Dalton pressed a hand to her chest. Mr. Brennan bowed his head slightly. Catherine's eyes filled, but she did not look away. She watched Alexander as he stood before the household and laid bare his failure, his grief, his love. When he finished speaking, the hall remained still. No one moved, no one spoke, and then Catherine stepped forward. Her heels echoed on the marble floor. She stopped before Alexander and looked at him. This man she had married out of duty. This man she had grown to love in the quiet spaces of their shared life. She extended her gloved hand and placed it gently over his. The gesture was witnessed by everyone present. It was not dramatic. It was not a grand declaration. It was a quiet, deliberate act of forgiveness and restored trust. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of grace he did not deserve. When he opened them, he lifted her hand and pressed it to his forehead once more, a gesture of humility rarely seen in a man of his station. The servants watched in silence, and then one by one, they bowed or curtsied and withdrew. They left the Duke and Duchess alone in the hall, together, changed, but united. The household dispersed quietly. The servants moved through the corridors with a new sense of purpose. The story of what had happened in the hall spread quickly. By midday, every member of the staff knew the truth, and they understood that something profound had taken place. Alexander and Catherine remained alone in the hall. The dawn light poured through the high windows, illuminating the marble floor in soft gold. For the first time in days, Alexander felt the possibility of rest. Catherine spoke softly. You did not need to tell them. Alexander shook his head. I needed them to know the truth, and I needed you to hear me say it. She nodded slowly. I should have told you what I had done. You should not have needed to, he replied. I should have trusted you without question. They stood together in the growing light. The mistakes had been named, the wounds acknowledged, and now something new could begin. The ball is this evening, Catherine said after a moment. I know. Do you still wish to proceed with it? Alexander looked at her. Do you? Catherine considered this. Then she smiled faintly. I think it would be good for the household. They have been worried. Then we will proceed. That evening, Ravenshire House would glow with candlelight. Guests would arrive in their finest attire. Music would fill the ballroom. and the Duke and Duchess would stand together, as they always had. But now there would be something different between them. Something deeper. Catherine removed her gloves carefully. It was a small ritual, a gesture of returning home. Alexander watched her, memorizing the moment. The way the light fell across her face. The way her hands moved with quiet grace. The way she looked at him, with understanding and forgiveness. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I know. I will never doubt you again, and I will never leave you in silence." They stood together in the hall. The house around them was waking. The day was beginning. And in the quiet space between heartbeats, two people who thought they knew love discovered it anew. That evening, Ravenshire House glowed with candlelight. The ballroom was filled with guests, lords and ladies in their finest attire, musicians tuning their instruments, servants moving through the crowd with trays of champagne and delicacies. The annual ducal ball was a tradition, a social obligation, but tonight it felt like something more. Catherine descended the grand staircase in a gown of deep sapphire. The fabric shimmered in the candlelight. Her hair was arranged elegantly. Her expression was calm, composed, but there was a softness in her eyes that had not been there 3 days ago. Alexander waited at the bottom of the stairs. He was dressed impeccably once more, his waistcoat buttoned, his cravat perfectly tied, his posture straight. But there was something different about him, too, a quiet humility, a depth that had not been visible before. When Catherine reached him, he offered his arm. She took it without hesitation. They entered the ballroom together. To the outside world, they were the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire, dignified, united, unshakable. But between them, something new had been forged. A love no longer based on duty or admiration alone, but on trust tested and restored. The music began, a waltz, slow and elegant. Alexander led Catherine onto the floor. They moved together with practiced grace. But there was a tenderness in the way he held her, a gratitude in the way she rested her hand on his shoulder. As they danced, Alexander leaned close and whispered, "I will never doubt you again." Catherine met his eyes, "And I will never leave you in silence." The music swelled. The candlelight flickered. The guests watched the Duke and Duchess with admiration, but they did not see what was truly happening. They did not see the forgiveness, the healing, the transformation. They saw only a perfect couple, dancing in a perfect ballroom, in a perfect house. But Alexander and Catherine knew the truth. Love was not perfect. It was tested, broken, and rebuilt. It was the quiet courage to forgive, to trust, to begin again. The night unfolded around them. The ball continued. The guests danced and laughed and celebrated. And in the center of it all, two people who thought they knew love discovered it anew. When the final waltz ended, Alexander and Catherine stood together in the center of the ballroom. The music faded. The guests applauded. And in the quiet space between heartbeats, they looked at each other and knew this was not the end of their story. It was the beginning.